And I'd like to open up for any questions at this point. Lots of food for thought. Any initial thoughts or questions? There's one over here and then one over there. We've got a microphone's just coming. One over here. On the left-hand side.
Can I be heard? Yeah. So my question is for, I don't know how to pronounce your name, the first speaker, Marta. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name.
No, it's very well pronounced.
Okay. All right. I really enjoyed all the presentations, but my question is for you. And I was very struck by the idea of collaborative work. You know, where you talked about the act of shared authorship, not collaborative work, but you talked about shared authorship when you were talking about the photography of, the couple. And I was wondering if there was a way of thinking of shared authorship, or rather this idea where authorship is not, or rather, I'm trying to articulate it, authorship is not just about pressing the trigger or pressing the button, but it's also about a certain kind of a imagination of the photograph. And the only other parallel I could think of was that I have worked on women's Zenana photography in India. Zenana photography is photography for women, by women, but in spaces where men could not enter. And very often, it was, the setup was in such a way that even when men went in, the framing was done by somebody else, but it's only that the men were taken in with a black cloth, literally taken in with a veil in front of the women, and then they just press the trigger. So I'm just trying to think this through about the whole business of technology versus imagination, because I think that the idea of authorship is a lot more than just and I'm sure that she helped with processing or whatever, but it may not necessarily be about pressing the trigger on the camera. I mean, I'm just wondering whether you'd like to respond to that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question.
I'm just wondering whether the question of authorship can go beyond. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that is photography only about pressing the button, or could it be about something else as well?
Sure, yeah, now I wasn't sure if I understood. Yeah, of course not. I mean, this is why, precisely, I'm saying that not only when she was the head of the business, but when she was not the head of the business, she was also making minimum 50% of the work in that studio. Pressing or not pressing is just like one tiny detail, and I think that there is much more about how do you address, or what's the frame of the photograph, what is the background, which at the time was a great deal, what kind of tools in the sense of furniture they would use. Sometimes there's like meta photography inside these photographs, because you can see how some people are relating to photography because using a camera within the picture, because using other photographs of maybe relatives or maybe there are tons of different things that relate and pertain to taking a photograph that do not talk necessarily just about pressing that button. I am not even sure, I mean, there are so many, I didn't have the time or the means to show you that today, but there are tons of photographs taken probably by Alejandrina, because these photographs are portraits of her husband. So this is obvious that at that time he was not taking or doing anything. So clearly, and that's why I mentioned, it is true that maybe too quickly, but that's why I mentioned mind and action is not only pressing the button, but is doing anything that relates to, from welcoming any client into the studio and taking note of what they want, how do they want to be portrayed, in which there are many photographs that I have seen in this Public National Library of Spain, in which you can see transgender ideas as well. Sure, I mean, of course not. And that's why, as to conclude, that's why I mentioned that when she was working with her husband and the nephew of her husband, she was doing the work as much as they were doing the work. It could also happen that one day she's not there and they are doing everything in the opposite way as well. So I would say, like, to be fair, minimum 50% in any dominion or any stage of the work, yes.
Thank you. Any further questions? I think we had one over here, yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your very interesting talks. I consider that it's very interesting to open this discussion also to male presentations. And I would like to address, so thank you, the organizer, for this very interesting congress. I would like to address the question to all of you. I am curator and photo historian and researcher, and I would like to ask if you think that we can suggest some specific methodological tools to our students in order to obtain some conclusions from the ontological point of view of research concerning this specific history of women photography. I was thinking about the presentation of Madame Heather, and I was thinking the formalism is, we can approach the formalism in a different way. Is it correct, is this acceptable from the ontological point of view to compare all these women that you have been referred, because the format is very different in USA and in Europe. We can also consider other parameters very important during the 20th century. I mean, the formalism, it was very important in the beginning of the century, and this change between USA and Europe was very, I was thinking about Jan Sodek also, who had made many photographies using glass and transparency. So my question is, can we sum up some key concept? Mr. David Bate, I include your book to my students always. Can we sum up some key points of methodological approach to this very important and very interesting attempt to make a history of, a global history of women photography? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, the first thing I would say, you know, since you're asking this question from a kind of pedagogical point of view with teaching, is to make sure that students look at the work. I mean, it sounds so basic, but it's often lost, because the way that so many histories are written, right, that students are told to see something in a particular way. And I think that it's a feminist gesture to say, look at it. What do you see? And in that way, it opens other possibilities. You know, and I see a lot of connections to David's comment about the failures of historical thinking. And so I would say methodologically, like, you know, and you mentioned it yourself, that there is more than one kind of formalism. This is important, that we shouldn't speak about these things with capital Fs, which is one of the reasons that I bring up, you know, this relationship between Edward Weston and Tino Moldari, because they were working in very different ways with formalism. Whereas his was really apolitical, hers was completely politicized. And I think even giving those kinds of examples to students to say, okay, what do you see? and what can be garnered from the actual image, from the actual photograph, and then working through the layers of the object, and then the historiography of how it's been talked about.
Yeah, well, research, I think, really is crucial, basically. I mean, if you look online about Teresa Bonney, right, for example, it says a lot of the people who've written blogs and stuff about her online will say she was the only photographer in the Finnish-Russian War, which is clearly not true. If you look at the press release for the show, or MoMA, it said what she would have written, or drafted at least. She was the only foreign photographer. So a lot of enthusiastic young writers who've wanted to promote Bonney in the last 2 years have said that she was the only photographer. Well, that's completely wrong. It feels wrong anyway to say there's only one photographer in a place. So I think research is really crucial, lots of examples of it here. But also the concepts that we use. I mean, the first question about co-authorship or collaboration, those are terms, or authorship really, shows how little work has been done in photography on what we mean by authorship. Like, if you go to a fashion industry, everyone who's involved in that is kind of acknowledged. You go to the movies, anyone who had a role in the film is acknowledged. You cannot make a film without, the gaffers, the people who make coffee, all of those people, the clothes and costumes and so forth, are all at least acknowledged now in contemporary practice. And the model that people are still using to think about history is like some person, an individual. And I suppose there has been a shift from, thinking about great men to great women. And that rehearses a debate that Linda Nochlin and all of those great feminist art historians knocked out in the 1980s, at least, to problematize and say it's not just about great individuals. That's the bourgeois version of history that we don't want. Because, well, certainly, my tutor was Griselda Pollock, who firmly believes in the importance of social history in the accounts of art, and we've heard many talks in this great conference about where people have done that. So I think that's, concepts and proper research are really crucial. That sounds like very boring, but it's true.
Maybe you take it from the other side. When I started writing about history of photography, this was no subject. Nobody accepted any thesis on history of photography in the mid-70s. It took me half a year to convince Bonn University to do so with me, because history of photography was no subject, neither for communication research nor for art history at that time. And so my first idea was a typical post-modern art, to say, just in the sense you described, it's that I had numbers of forgotten photographers. I'm a son of a photographer. I knew the colleagues of my father, and I knew the colleagues somewhere around. So I made a long list of forgotten photographers. They were half male, half female. I never thought about that. And then things changed. So to rearrange Lucia Maholi as a photographer has now to be corrected. That's what I described, because times have changed, feminist theory has changed, all these elements have changed, and the epistemology has changed completely, as you have been describing. And so that's a process, and I think that's the process you can teach.
Not here. Thank you. I have a question for Rolf. I was wondering, you gave us a very analytic account, let's say, of her biography. And since we are in a women's photographies conference, what sort of relations did Lucia had with other women, either in the Bauhaus or later in her life? Especially photographers or artists? Thank you.
She had many relations to other people. She had lots of people she influenced. The most important influence is Florence Henry, who always wrote that she learned everything from Lucia Moholy. So this is one. Many women of the Bauhaus were using her and using her vicinity. Marianne Brandt was closely cooperating with her and others. But Lucia Moholy was not really thinking about that. That's clear. She loved to love men. That's very clear. I tried to count the number of near acquaintances, to be polite, and this is quite a long list. And she was a sort of femme fatale at the Bauhaus. And so the relation to women were more or less in a secondary way. She never considered photography to be interesting enough to be taught. She said, okay, it's a media technique. You learn this within a weekend or within 2 weekends, and that's it. And so she never considered this to be any idea of something. She had a very reproductive idea of photography, and that was mainly the course. She wanted to know what to do with photography, not how to do a photograph, not to consider a photograph. And that's the reason why so many museums run by women at the time in the 1980s did refuse to buy her prints. We wanted to finance the book on selling some prints. And we had to find another form of finance because nobody bought any print by Lucia Moholy. Today it's slightly different.
Thank you so much. Such excellent research. I learned so much. All the things are coming together. 2 quick questions, hopefully. Marta, for you, such a small detail. Were you able to locate why she was not able to get her widow's pension?
Yes, but it's really long. So
is it okay? Maybe later.
Yeah, I did. I mean,
I have
one of
theories.
the great things about archives when it relates to public institutions, at least in Spain, I'm talking about that context, is that we have an archive that is called General Archive for the Public Administration in general, just like that. And they have, like, I can't remember, but it's about 100 and some pages on every single process.
Okay.
It's 3 processes all total. So every single process is absolutely documented with everything that you need to appeal to court, what happens when you appeal the second time, the third time, when you like blah, 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 everything. So yes.
Okay. I mean, in my fantasy, it's because she was such an independent businesswoman that there might have been some, but we'll talk later.
Okay,
I hope.
great.
And thank you all so much. David, you're blowing my mind with this because I'm at the International Center of Photography. I just did a quick search online on the archives, which is not always thorough. It's not all online, but I don't see any of her work there. There may be. I learned under 2 brilliant photographers as my mentors in art school at 19, who very much were the product, as many of us, of those the MoMA boy textbooks, right? One of those women I worked with came out of Texas and would have been the right age to be about 19, learning from some of the Texas Bauhaus women. We never looked at that work in undergraduate, and we had extensive lectures, and it was always the same textbooks, the MoMA textbooks, So I'm curious, was her work mentioned in any of those textbooks written by Newhall? And it's just incredible.
She's not there, and it's really curious that she's, clearly in a canon. But then post-war, there's like this amnesia, because she was kind of more, anthropological isn't far off, and she thinks about the photograph not as an aesthetic form,
Right.
Walker Evans, etc. So, if you like, the aesthetic thread of photography that MoMA
Exactly.
goes on to generate, Christopher Phillips has written very beautifully about
Yeah.
that, a judgment seat of photography, that she gets written out of that.
Right.
It's curious that, I mean, there was some scholarship, actually Griselda was, I have to thank her, she pointed me to this, that she was doing some work in MoMA about history of women artists in MoMA. And, you know, one of the things is that there's this person who had the first woman show in MoMA, happened to be a photographer that no one's heard of. So if you go to MoMA, if you Google Teresa Bonney and MoMA, she's there. But if you then go to their own like archive of photographic exhibitions from that period, she's not there. They haven't put it there still. And that's MoMA, right? So this is like, you know, she's a margin of a massive centre, but was in the centre and has been marginalised because clearly the work doesn't fit. There may be something else because there is this story that she's a spy, and in later life post-war she wrote columns regularly for the Figaro newspaper in Paris, which is a fairly right-wing newspaper. Yeah. So it may be that she wasn't as a person particularly, I mean, I don't know, that most of her archive, her personal archive is in California, and someone is doing like writing a book on her, which is a sort of biographical book, not specifically about photography. And I would need to get to that archive to really dig a bit more and find out. So if you've got any money to get me to California, anyone, please let me know.
Thank you. I'm being greedy and asking a second question. Very quick question to you, David. How do you compare Teresa with, I mean, what do you see, how do you see her with Margaret Bourke-White? Because, I mean, they are also, you know, they're two photographers photographing conflict. One you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said at the end that one of the reasons was that she was also documenting peace. I mean, you made that point. And I'm just wondering about Bourke-White, who's photographing the Second World War, who's much more prominent in the history of the so-called history of Euro-American history. Is it to do with what Vicky Goldberg talks about, you know, this very kind of, you know, she's got this very flamboyant persona. What is it? What do you think? I mean, when you compare, it's difficult to compare, but just your thoughts, quick thoughts on that.
I wouldn't pick her out only because I don't know if you saw, I didn't really flag it up, but there's a photograph of Teresa Bonney by Lee Miller when she was in London. Very nice picture. And I don't know if there's a reverse one. The thing to say would be the first show of women photographers at MoMA was in 1949, and Margaret Bourke-White was in that. So was Dorothea Lange. And there's a third famous photographer whose name I can't remember, and then two other people that I had never heard of. So there's a show of 5 women photographers, and Teresa Bonney is not in that in 1949, so she's already disappeared by 1949. And it seems that, you know, I mean, that book, I've been astonished about it, and it's rocketing in price because people have realised she's being canonized. So the market takes over. This is what happened, right? As soon as you guys flag up these people, there's an archive that then gets monetized. That book did have a profound impact, and I was thinking, you know, this genuine provocation I felt in that talk about what photography is appropriate in wartime. She was photographing, you know, relentlessly children who were abandoned, and I don't think we understand how vast that issue was in World War II. That, you know, kids in concentration camps who were just, you know, let out, basically. There are so many problems that there were kids wandering around, you know, pretty much like Ukraine-Russia war. I mean, there's extraordinary parallels between that war. Sorry, I'm drifting off, but so yeah, she was very clearly very privileged in some ways, very good at getting grants. I mean, she got to the Sorbonne with like half a dozen scholarships, and just driven to do stuff all the time. So it's just such an, you know, kind of, they say something like that, force of nature, incredible character. It's just extraordinary but she's so invisible. So.
It's one of those moments when you listen to a panel and a light bulb hits your head, because it's extremely exciting for somebody who's just starting off in the field to have such perspectives, fresh perspectives. So I would like to bring in two things, and this is also from a very personal project interest. Heather, you mentioned in context of Modotti that Modotti made photos for reproduction, sacrificed clarity and precision to get a larger audience. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about that, why you think that was the case, and going back to the question of pedagogy and methodology, because that's something that I'm interested in looking at how images get circulated, reproduced, as a feminist methodology to locate then the works and the value of that work. So I would like to hear a little more about that, and also linking that to what David said, a history of, and it's so well articulated, history of photography is not a history of photography when it does not address history. And I was thinking of history in terms of precisely what it is that we look at when we look at history. And something that I think sometimes gets missed is how these images get circulated. And because that speaks to the conditions in which women are making images, and how they're trying to get their images across to an audience, how they're preserving it for posterity because the fine prints might not be available. So just if anybody else would like to respond, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because actually, as I was saying those lines, I was thinking of you and your presentation the other day and your comments about, you know, the blurriness of the image. And there are absolutely parallels. I mean, and so it's, for one thing, to acknowledge that Modotti was practical and politically practical. So she wanted these images to circulate. So when her work is talked about as depicting icons of revolution, that's not simply, you know, an art history iconography. It's actually that those images were being printed in publications like El Machete, that they were circulated in workers' newspapers, right? So they had value and were intended to do something far beyond being hung on a wall as a pretty image, right? So, you know, that like her roses is a very popular print, right? Like you can buy this roses all over the place. You can get it on handbags, but that most uses of that now is as something that's beautiful. But roses are loaded with revolution, and so Modotti is tapping into that. And I think this, the fact that she wasn't privileging clarity, that wasn't what she was trying to achieve, that wasn't the most important part, is particularly interesting when the subject matter is glass, which then kind of, you know, brings in these other powerful metaphors. Yeah.
And just a quick comment.
Yeah.
But just a quick addition to that, because photography, both how we think of it ontologically and also the history of photography in itself, is so fundamentally related to this reproducibility.
Yes.
And something that we forget in all of this contemporary talks on aesthetics and the clarity of image and the sharpness of image, that for photographs, going back to Benjamin, is precisely what makes it a photograph is its reproducibility. So I've been trying to think of form, and your analysis of form was very, very appreciated because we don't get to see enough of that kind of work anymore, the rigor of it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah,
sorry.
Well, thank you for your question. And just to add one more sort of potential element, that seeing this embrace of the reproduction of the photographic image as a feminist strategy, I think that's part of it too.
Yeah.
Have we got any more questions at this stage? There's a mic down here.
Well, thank you for the interesting talks. The ones I heard were kind of like added quite something. And this is a question for Rolf. It's regarding the Bauhaus women only were kind of sidelined quite a bit. You know, there's Annie Albers and others, which just had a big exhibition in the Tate, and people suddenly, wow, and they were relegated to textile and other things. And so my question was, in your conversations, even though she said she was more interested in relationships with the men, but did she mention anything that the women were kind of maybe a bit, because it was already happening, obviously, at the time, and afterwards? And I had the luck to once talk to Hannah Höch as well, so, which was, they also thought the puppets and all this is like a female thing, but now it's very much appreciated. But the question is, like, was there any conscious on her side? Was there any maybe a bit like the women were kind of a bit short shafted there?
To be honest, these questions are really wide, and that's the reason why I choose the biographical approach as a method here, because otherwise it's really difficult to make it understand. If you take the situation of the Bauhaus from the beginning, from the very start, and this only came out by some archival exhibitions in 2019, then you find exactly these words by Walter Gropius that women are only allowed in the textile department, except for Marianne Brandt, who fought for that. That was one thing, but the other thing was, and that was Lucia Maholi's appearance like when they arrived in the Bauhaus in May 1923, preparing the exhibition for August 1923, which was the time of the hyperinflation. So everybody was working 8 hours a day for simply getting food. So that was a time when you didn't have much time for anything else, for deriving ideas and whatever. So anyone was fighting at the time. And then she had the strongness, because she had been paying for Laszlo and her life all the time. She had been the one who had been, just like you be describing in the studios, and I could add hundreds of studios to your story with women in the back, and including my mother, and so on and so on. And so the situation was like this, that somebody like Lucia Maholi and Annie Albers too, they refused to discuss this topic. They refused to consider that women had a special role in the Bauhaus. Their idea was, we are so strong that we don't have to discuss our feminist approach. That's a very typical modern idea of the 1920s. If you talk to many people to many women who had their in the 80s I was lucky to produce roughly 100 interviews with female and male photographers who were active in the 1920s and 1930s. And all of the women never considered to be anything like a female aspect. They simply refused to discuss that. It was their way of surviving all this, and it was their way of dealing with it. My own grandmother, who emigrated from Germany to the US too, they never talked about that. They simply said, we had the situation, we survived that situation, and we found methods to find ourselves. And they were exactly proud on this, that they were doing exactly the same things like the men. So this is a different approach, and the difficulty today is, if you take a biographical approach, and I really see the limits of that, it's difficult to understand how it works. It's the same with your work, with Teresa Bonney. Yeah? How far do we get into the biography? How far do we get into the situation? And then you take the materiality of photography, which is a different approach. So you have at least different epistemological ideas about it and try to find out a way of writing a situation. And the problem with the Bauhaus is it's the most overemphasized art school in the world. So you have to destroy the idea of the Bauhaus anyway before you can think about female history in the 1920s.
Thank you.
Any final questions? Got a couple more minutes if anyone's got a question. I think lunch is calling and we've just destroyed the Bauhaus, so...